today's lecture. And as usual, please follow along. If you have any questions, just let us know. We like to take all the questions at the end, but of course, just let us know. So basically, we are looking at story data on the cloud, and the service that is responsible for that on AWS, the service that is majorly used for that is what we call Amazon S3. And Amazon S3 means simple storage service. So because it has three S's, that's why they call it S3. It's one of the main building blocks of AWS, right? It is a secure, durable, and highly scalable object storage service from AWS. And you can use it to store all kinds of files. See, when you think about Amazon S3, I just want you to think about a folder on your laptop. You can literally store any file on your laptop. You can store MP3, you can store MP4 movie, you can store picture, JPEG, PNG, you can store PDF, you can store doc, you can store JSON file. Even files that your laptop may not be able to open, you can still store it there. That's exactly what Amazon S3 is. So just looking at this bucket and having all sorts of images, all sorts of files being able to go inside, that's what we mean by S3. So it's a very beautiful, it's one of the first services that AWS actually released, and it's so versatile. One of the use cases of S3 is a company called Pinterest, right? Some of you know this company, Pinterest. They basically just store images. Pinterest actually uses AWS S3 to store and send billions of images to its users. So those images, so whether you have your own, set of images on Pinterest, or maybe you're checking somebody else's board and stuff, all those images are actually stored on Amazon S3. S3 helps Pinterest to store and deliver images at scale, and is also integrated with other services like Amazon CloudFront, like Amazon Elastic Transcoder, etc. Another company is actually Spotify. So Spotify actually uses S3 to store and serve its music streaming service to millions of users around the world. So S3 helps Spotify to store and process vast amounts of data and deliver at scale. So S3 is very versatile and is used by a lot of different organizations. You'll be surprised, many organizations, NASA, so many of them, behind what they're doing, they're actually using Amazon S3. So when you think of S3, think about a folder on your laptop. The only difference is that now you can do super cool things with the data that you have in S3, as opposed to just your data sitting down, your file sitting down in your folder on your laptop. There's so many things that you can do with your file being in an S3 bucket. So we have what we call S3 buckets and objects, right? So an S3 bucket is the basic unit of storage in S3. And then an object is a file that is being stored in S3. So you can see we have objects, and then we have an S3 bucket. And then when you put the objects in an S3 bucket, you have an S3 bucket with objects. So every time you see this logo in AWS, you know you're referring to an S3 bucket. It actually looks like a bucket. I don't know if some of you know this pail that we used to use many years ago. That's what it looks like, right? And then we have S3 buckets with objects, right? So all these objects are different files, MP3, MP4, and all of that can actually have them inside an S3 bucket. So a bucket is a container directory where objects can be stored, can be accessed and stored. Now, how do you create an S3 bucket? You can create it through the AWS Management Console, which you're going to do today. So you can just log into your AWS account, and then you go and create a bucket, and then you define the different features of that bucket. Or you can use what we call the command line interface. Some of you are familiar with this. So basically, it's like you're interacting with computer using lines of code. So you can do AWS S3 create, and then it can create an S3 bucket for you. Now we also have S3 bucket can also be integrated with other services, just like I said that Pinterest does, right? So you can integrate it with other services to provide additional functionality for storing and processing the data. So what makes S3 cool? Apart from the fact that it stores the data, it's it's really, really large storage. There's no limit to how many files you can store in S3 and all of that. Beautiful thing is that you can actually intelligently process the data that you have stored in an S3 bucket. So when you're choosing your name for an S3 bucket, have this in mind. You can't use uppercase letters, right? You can also not use underscore. And your text should be within 3 to 63 characters long. Then also don't use an IP. An IP is numbers that computers are identified with. And then the S3 bucket name also needs to start with a lowercase letter or a number. So it's important for you to know that S3 names are always unique as well, right? So which means that if you have created an S3 bucket that has a particular name, nobody else can create an S3 bucket with that name. It is unique. It has to be unique globally. So when you're creating your S3 bucket today, they'll tell you to add some unique characters to it just to make it different and somebody else. So no matter where the person is, as long as the person has an AWS account, they cannot actually create an S3 bucket with the same name. So if you're trying to create an S3 bucket that says Hello World or Hello World bucket, so somebody else has created it already, so you have to make sure that your bucket name is actually unique in addition to having all of these things in mind. Now for the S3 object as well, an S3 object consists of the following, right? It has a key. That's the name that you assign to an object. It has the value, the content that you're storing. It has a version ID. That's if you enable versioning, and I'll talk about that shortly. And then it has metadata. That's every other thing, set of name value pairs with which you can store information regarding the object. So you may have other details you want to store about the object. Maybe the date it was created. That can be a metadata. You can want to store anything at all about the object. If you have a movie file, maybe you want to store the name of the producer of the movie, you can create a metadata for it. So producer of the movie, director of the movie, anything at all, any information you want to store about the object, it falls within the metadata category. So name value pairs that you can use to store information regarding the object, right? Which is really, really cool. Now, we also have what we call S3 versioning. This is a very cool technology as well. This is something that you can't do with a file just sitting down in a folder on your laptop. So versioning enables users to keep multiple versions of objects in the same S3 buckets. And this applies to all file types. Now, if you have versioning enabled, every time an object is uploaded to an S3 bucket, a new version of that object is created instead of overriding the existing objects. Versioning provides an additional layer of data protection, and it also prevents accidental deletes. It is enabled at bucket level. So let me explain. So for example, let's assume that you have created an S3 bucket and you have enabled versioning on that bucket. And on that bucket, you have stored a file called info.txt. And this file, the only content in that file is I am a girl. That's what you've written in that file. And then this info.txt file, you upload into your S3 buckets. Quite all right. Now, if you have enabled S3 versioning on that bucket, what happens is that you've uploaded that file to your bucket, right? But the file is still on your laptop and you can edit it however you like. So if you edit it and you update it and you say, okay, I'm adding more information to that file. I want to write, I'm a girl living in London. Still the same info.txt file. Now, if you upload this same file into that bucket that has versioning enabled, what happens is that S3 is going to store another version, another copy of this info.txt. So it doesn't override it. And then if you do the same thing again, you update the file on your local computer. You say, I'm a girl living in London with my dog, right? And you upload it again into an S3 bucket that has versioning enabled. Again, a third copy of that file is actually created. So this actually helps to keep record of all the different versions of your file. So at any point in time, you can decide that, oh, I want to quickly revert back to the first version, the original version I had. You can easily find it because all of them are saved as multiple files on your S3 bucket. Now, another thing about versioning is that if you actually delete this file called info.txt, what happens is that you simply place a delete marker on that file, and that delete marker can be removed anytime. So that's also another thing that makes versioning very powerful. So if you actually have versioning enabled on a bucket, you cannot delete anything inside that object, inside that bucket, unless you disable versioning. So this way, you can prevent accidental deletes. But what also that happens is that you can't just indefinitely enable versioning for every single condition. You have to think about it. In this kind of scenario, do you actually need to enable versioning? You use versioning when you know that you're dealing with a very critical document, you know that you don't want it to get deleted. You have to think about the use case before you make that decision, because imagine the fact that every single time you're uploading it, you're updating the document, it's saving a new version. What does that tell you? It's taking up more space. And versioning it also has its own cost implication. So you have to really think about these things when you're, again, like I said, every time you're thinking about what you're building as a solutions architect, as a cloud DevOps engineer, as a platform engineer, you have to think about the cost and the benefits of what you're getting. So does the benefit really outweigh the cost, right? If you're dealing with document that if it gets missing, it's a game changer, like it's going to spoil your application, then you may need to think about enabling versioning. And if you're dealing with something that, you know, maybe it changes very quickly, multiple people are using the file, you want to be able to revert back to an original version as soon as possible, then you may need to consider versioning. But you don't need to use it every single time just because it's a good thing, because it's going to cost you some money and it's also going to take up space, right? Even though there's infinite storage, just be aware each space you're taking up in an S3, actually you're spending more money. So you can't really delete anything once version is enabled. You put a delete marker. This thing actually is a question that it tests the understanding a lot in your solutions architect exam. And yeah, it's actually S3 generally just comes out a lot in your AWS solutions architect exam, which is what we're preparing for in Cloud Booster. We give you, but our main focus at Cloud Booster is actually the hands-on, and then we actually give you the resources that you need to prepare for your exam. So it's a two-edged sword. So that's how versioning works. Very, very powerful tool, and it's something to consider depending on the use case. Now, we also have S3 storage classes. Sorry, one second. I think there's something in the chat box. What do you mean? Can you configure the naming convention? Clarify the question, but if what you're trying to say, you can choose anything as your name for the S3 buckets.
Yeah, I was just trying to find out. Hi, sorry. I was just trying to find out if, you know, with the versioning part, you can say maybe version 1 is v.1, version 2 is v.11, version 3 is v.11. Like, I was just trying to understand if you can configure the name.
So are you talking about the name of the file?
Yes, the name of a file, yeah.
So that's a good question. Now, you don't need to rename the file but AWS has a way of letting you identify version 1, version 2, and all of those versions. Do you know why you don't need to rename the file? Because once you rename the file, it's going to look at it as a different file completely. Do you understand what I'm saying?
So I'm not
okay.
Sorry, I'm not saying to rename the file itself. So I know you've just said AWS has a way of letting you know the latest one. Okay, I think that's all answers.
Okay, so it's a means of identification. Yeah. So yes, there is a way to identify it. Yeah. So that's a very good question, by the way. So anyway, so yeah, we also have what we call S3 storage classes. It's also very important. So as much as we have AWS S3 and you can create a bucket, there are different storage classes, right, that we have. And what that means is that there are different wait, so let me just read this out. AWS provides a range of storage classes, each defined to meet different performance, durability, availability, and cost requirements. So you can actually choose what storage class you want for your S3 buckets. So you can choose from various options based on the data access, resilience, and cost requirements of your workloads. S3 storage classes are purpose-built to provide the lowest cost storage for different access patterns. So what do we mean by that? Different S3 buckets, you can choose, when you're creating an S3 bucket, you can choose what storage class you want. So we have different types. We have about 7 different types, and this keeps changing. Sometimes they remove, sometimes they add new ones. So we have what we call S3 standard. We have what we call S3 intelligent tiering, right? We have different storage classes, and all of this is just so that you can make a decision as to what exactly am I trying to store and what exactly is going to be the most cost-effective way to store it. Now, one major criteria as to what differentiates all of these things is what we call the access frequency. There are other factors, but let's start with access frequency. So how frequently you want to access your file is a factor that would help you determine which of the storage classes you're going for. So for example, for S3 standard, if it's a file that you want to be able to access every day, when you access it, you want it to be available immediately, then you want to consider S3 standard. And as you go down, it reduces it frequently. So any file that you don't want to access very frequently. That's why this graph says infrequent here and this one says frequent. If you know that maybe, for example, you only need to access it once a year, then you want to consider putting it in S3 Glacier Deep Archive. I'm not going to go into details of this. We're going to talk about it in class once you're part of the training, but I just want you to have a general idea of what we're talking about here. So another thing we consider is retrieval time. If you want a file that whenever you check, you want to retrieve it, you give the command and the file comes up immediately, then you want to consider files in this direction. You want to consider these options, right? The standard, intelligent terrain, and all of that. But if you don't mind the retrieval time being long, then you're considering in this direction, the right-hand side, which is deep archive. Because the retrieval time for deep archive can even take, it can take seconds, it can take minutes, it can take even hours before it can retrieve that file. But guess what? It's cheaper. So you need to think about the use case. So we have S3 standard, we have intelligent terrain, we have standard infrequently accessed, we have S3 one zone infrequently accessed. This one is only available in one, is only going to be available in one availability zone. If you choose this storage class, your document is only available in one availability zone. So what does that mean? It means that if the availability zone should go down, your document is missing. But guess what? It's cheaper than the higher versions, the other versions that are towards your left, I mean. So we also have S3 Glacier Instant Retrieval, right? Out of the 3 Glacier options, this one is the fastest and it still takes minutes to retrieve. We also have Glacier Flexible Retrieval. We have Glacier Deep Archive. So my point is that for your S3 buckets, you have different storage classes that you can choose from, depending on the use case. You can't just say whenever you're building, you want to build on S3 standard alone because the pricing is different. S3 standard is the most expensive, but also gives you the most flexibility. The retrieval time is the shortest and all of that. But there are some documents that you don't actually need to access all every day. So why would you keep it in S3 standard? So this is how to think as a cloud architect, right? Everything is always on a case-by-case basis. What am I trying to do? And what do I need? What is the most cost-effective way for me to go about this in a way that still serves the purpose? There are some files that are easily recreatable. If it gets missing, you can easily create it again. You can put that in one zone infrequently accessed, because even if it gets deleted, if the availability zone should go down, it won't be a problem for you. There are some things like log files, audit files, files about manuals, how to use your particular software. If you already understand how to use software, you're only trying to keep a record of the file. You can put it in deep archive. You don't mind anytime you need it. You can wait hours. You can put the command the day before and say, I need this file tomorrow. You don't mind. And you're still storing on S3, but it's a cheaper option. So just be aware that there are different storage. We'll go into the details of this in your main lecture. Another thing that you need to know is we have S3 lifecycle policies. So you can imagine, we're just talking about storing data on the cloud, and look at all the cool features. Look at the different things I was saying. You can enable versioning. You can use different storage classes. You can actually pay less for some different categories and all of that. It's so beautiful. It's different from just having a folder sitting on your laptop. So these are the technologies that makes S3 really different and really revolutionary. So S3 lifecycle policy also enables users to automatically transition objects between different storage classes or expire them after a specific period. You can apply this to an object or you can apply it to an entire bucket. So this is an example of a lifecycle policy. Do you know that if you keep objects in a bucket in S3, you can actually give the command that, for this particular object that I've kept in this bucket, I want it to initially be on, I want you to use S3 standard for it initially. Now, 30 days after creation, please change the storage class to S3 standard infrequently accessed because it's cheaper. You can also now set the rule that 60 days after it has been created, move that object to S3 Glacier. And then you can now say, okay, 465 days after it has been created, I want you to delete the object. You can actually configure all of this from the beginning. So you just think about it, this particular file, in the first 30 days when I'm developing this software, I'm going to really need to be able to access it frequently. But after that, I don't need to access it very frequently again. So move it to a tier that you pay less. You can actually do that. After a while, you can be like, well, I actually don't need it again after 2 months. Let me move it to Glacier where it can be there. The retrieval time is long. I don't mind, and all of that. You put it in S3 Glacier. And then you can decide that, after 2 years, after 1 year, after 1.5 years, just delete this particular file. I wouldn't need it again. This file is only relevant for the first 2 years. You can program it upfront and you can change it anytime as well. So imagine all of these things that you can do with S3 buckets. It's really, really cool. So we also have what we call data encryption in S3. Encryption, generally, you've heard about it before. You've seen it. It's a language that is very popular in the computing world. Encryption is a means of securing digital data using one or more mathematical techniques, along with a password or a key that you can use to decrypt it. I always say, when you think of encryption, think of padlock and key. That's what it is. You put padlock on what you're trying to secure, right? You want to secure your gate, you put padlock on it. and then you take the key, you go away with it. You don't leave the key on the padlock, right? You put padlock or whatever it is that you're trying to hide, or whatever it is you're trying to secure, and then you go away with your key. That's how encryption is. So basically, you have data that you're trying to secure, you encrypt it, right? That's where you're putting your padlock on, and then you need a decryption key anytime you want to unlock that data, anytime you want to make sense out of that data. So you always need a key that you use to decrypt the information. So encryption is basically just making the information unreadable, making it not make sense for somebody else, such that nobody can hack it, right? So you can actually do data encryption in S3 as well. You can protect or encrypt your data while in transit, as it moves from S3 to and from S3, or while at rest, while it's just sitting at your S3 bucket, or where it's stored in your data center. You can just encrypt it. You can encrypt it while it's in motion, or encrypt it while at rest. So encryption translates information using an algorithm that makes the original information unreadable, and then decryption is the process of converting the encrypted data back into the original readable format using a decryption key or a password. So bear in mind, you can do this with S3 as well. And then finally, other industry use cases. Like I said, so many people use S3. NASA uses S3 to store and process vast amounts of scientific data collected from space missions and experiments. Imagine how much data NASA is handling. They need a lot of data processing, and they use S3 for that. So S3 helps NASA to store and access this data securely and reliably. Airbnb also uses S3 because they all run on AWS. Airbnb also uses S3 to store and serve user-generated content like photos, videos, and reviews. And then S3 helps Airbnb to provide a seamless experience to users by delivering fast and reliable content. You can build your website today and then keep all your image files on S3. Today, you're going to do a really cool lab on S3. You're going to create your own website, you're going to store the data on S3, and then you can see how S3 can actually be used to deliver a website. So it's beautiful. You can use S3 alone to deliver a website, or you can have your website running on an EC2 instance or running somewhere else, and then you just decide that you want to use S3 to store your images. I've done that for my personal brand website before, where I was running my website on a particular platform, and then all the images were on an S3 bucket, and then we'll just load it on an S3 bucket. Right, so it was fast, it was reliable, and all of that. Sometimes you go to a website, you see that the box that is supposed to, instead of you to have an image there, it's just one very small box in one corner because the image is not loading properly. Maybe it was where they stored the image. Okay, so that's about S3. Really, really cool technology you'll be exposed to. There's a lot more. Actually, that's not that. There's a lot more, but we just wanted to give you some just lay the foundation for your journey of storing data, because like I said, Microsoft Azure has its own equivalent, but again, it's still the same thing. They have different storage classes. You can do versioning, you can do data encryption, right? The concept is the same. They just have a different name for all of the things that we have just described on AWS. So that brings us to the end of the lecture today, and I have other cool things lined up for you guys. Again, in the meantime, do you have any questions? I hope you're you're getting more interested in this cloud world. It's actually a really, really cool technology that will be here for many years to come. Even with the rise of AI and all of that, you still need to process the data. AI collected data needs to be processed. You're doing machine learning. The reason why machine learning makes sense is because the data that you're getting, you're processing it, and you're able to make decisions based on all of that data. So everything in IT runs on an infrastructure. It needs to have a place where it's loading from. It needs to have a place where you're processing the data. And that's where cloud computing comes in. So there's so much to explore. There are different DevOps tools as well. There's Git, there's Linux, there's Python, there's so many things. So you can actually use your understanding of cloud. So someone is asking a question: does this relate to AI? What precisely? But if I'm telling you something that is AI with S3 buckets, there's actually an S3 storage class. I didn't touch on it because I wanted that to be your main lecture, but let me just mention it very briefly. So there's something called S3 Intelligent Tiering, the second storage class. S3 Intelligent Tiering. I'm just showing you an infusion of AI in some of the things that we're doing in our cloud computing. But generally, anyway, I'll come back to what I was saying about AI initially. But if we're talking about the relationship between what I've just said and AI, One example is this S3 intelligent terrain. I talked about standard, I talked about one zone, I talked about these things very briefly. Now, S3 intelligent terrain works on AI and machine learning. So if you decide that you want to use a storage class, what happens is that you're actually enabling a feature that studies the file that you've stored in an S3 bucket. It studies it and says that, okay, you know what, this particular file that is based on this S3 bucket, this end user, she accesses it very, very frequently. If that's the case, they'll move it to, they will the object will remain in S3 standard. But if it has studied the pattern of your accessing it, you put the object in S3 standard, but you don't access it very frequently. If you decide that you're using the S3 intelligent terrain, what happens is that it just looks at the pattern of how frequently is this data being accessed. If it's accessed very frequently, it leaves it in S3 standard. If it's not accessed very frequently, it moves it into what is more relevant, like S3 standard IA or one zone IA, depending on how you're using it. So a good, and if you're not sure of what your how frequently you're going to access your data, you can't make a decision about whether to put it on S3 standard or S3 standard IA and all of that, then you can consider intelligent terrain. So intelligent terrain will just study the pattern of how frequently is this document being accessed. Why is it in S3 standard? Let's move it to S3 standard IA. Let's move the storage class. So that's the way that AI is applied specifically for S3, but there's still many applications of AI on the cloud, and one of it is what I was saying around even using cloud to actually process data gotten from AI. So okay, so that's one relationship, the S3 buckets I described. Zainab, I hope that helps. How does other AWS service connect to each other? Is this via gateway or API? So it depends on what you're trying to do. There are API connections with different services as well. So for example, you can connect, you can decide to, you can create an I don't know how much you know, but it depends on what you're connecting. Most times the API connections between different services. So you can decide that you have an S3, this is a popular lab in Cloud Booster, you have an S3 bucket, and then, you have an EC2 instance, which is a virtual machine, and then you want to connect to a database, right? You can make that connection. You just need to make sure that, you've properly defined the different parameters, and then you have your security groups enabled as well. All of this, I haven't covered it today. These are lectures within your, but yeah, we have a whole lecture, computing on the cloud, EC2 instance. So if we can ask you to create an EC2 instance, and then we say connect it to a database, right? And then, you make the necessary API connections. And then the key thing you also need to think about is actually allowing traffic to flow from your EC2 instance to your database. Don't worry, if you don't understand what I'm saying, it's fine. I'm just answering Frank's question. These are things you will learn. You will learn everything from scratch in Cloud Booster. We don't assume that, even though you have a tech background, that just helps you to be able to understand what we're doing, probably be able to pick up the things faster. You already know how you learn things in tech, it's practical, blah blah blah. But when you come to Cloud Booster, we're not assuming you know everything. We're going to teach you everything from scratch, so you will see actually how you connect services. So you can actually, so you just need to ensure that traffic is enabled, you have your security groups correctly defined, such that your EC2 instance can connect to your database. Yeah, every now and then you connect your EC2 instance to your S3. You want to store some things in your S3 buckets. You can do all those connections, so that, yeah, that's possible. Do we have any other questions? Any other questions? Today is about you, supporting you on the journey, right? And helping you to clarify the very different things. So that's actually all the lecture I had today, which is good. So you get to actually build. People enjoy the practical sessions, so you actually get to build all these things we're talking about. Let's actually go and check. You want to and explore things beyond what we put in your lab. So that's another thing I need to mention. Very soon, when you get to your lab session, there'll be a lab demo that just shows you what your lab should look like, and then there would also be you now going to build in your breakout room, right? Please, we give these labs for you to use so that you can follow the instructions. Sometimes what we find is that some people actually, you will read the instruction or you won't read it properly, and then you start saying, oh, Tosi, can you help me with this? It's not working. Please make sure that you read it and you understand exactly what you've been asked to do. If you actually follow the instructions we give you step by step, it will work. If you get stuck, of course, we're there to help you. But let your first response not be, without reading it. Read it first. Ensure that you've properly interpreted what we've told you first before you start calling for help. So that's one thing that we do at Cloud Booster. We encourage you because the student-led learning, right? We are the center of the learning. We want you to understand what we're doing. We want you to understand what we're talking about, right? So it's important that you actually try it. You do the hands-on. You build it by yourself. Share your screen when they ask you to. And please wait for your turn as well. Your facilitator may be attending to somebody, and then you also want to be attended to. Just patient, we'll get to you. Our facilitators have been trained, they know what to do, they will attend to each person. Just be patient, give us time, and we're here to support and to help your cloud journey. So that brings us to the end of the lecture. Like I've said, thank you all for listening. Hand over back to Grace to tell you what you're doing for the rest of today.
Thank you so much, Bemi. Hi again, everyone.